There is a parking lot on the edge of Dubai International Airport that most travelers never see. It sits beyond the terminal exits, past the taxi queues and the glass facades and the duty-free perfume clouds, in a corner of the city that receives no postcards and generates no Instagram content. And in that lot, collecting layers of fine desert sand across their hoods and windshields, sit some of the most expensive automobiles ever manufactured. A Ferrari 458 Italia, a Lamborghini Aventador, a Bugatti Veyron. Doors unlocked, keys still in the ignition. Left there not by accident and not by negligence, but by calculation. This is not a rumour. It is not a social media exaggeration. Between 2,000 and 3,000 vehicles are formally impounded by Dubai authorities every single year for abandonment. The Dubai municipality's own waste management department confirmed the figure to Gulf News: 2,053 vehicles towed in a single 7-month period alone. The cars sit in airport lots, in the underground garages beneath shopping malls, along the shoulders of elevated highways, in gated compounds baking under a sun that reaches 50 degrees Celsius in summer. Their paint fades, their leather interiors crack and split. Their engines, worth more than most people earn in a decade, seize from disuse. The images that surface online, filmed by automotive enthusiasts and urban explorers who have made Dubai's car graveyards a recurring subject, show machines that cost $200,000, $500,000, sometimes over $1 million, sitting completely forgotten. A McLaren 720S with a parking ticket pinned under a wiper blade, buried under 2 inches of dust. A Rolls-Royce Ghost in a municipal impound yard, surrounded by rusted sedans and broken motorcycles, as if luxury itself had somehow forgotten its own address. When Dubai police identify an abandoned vehicle, a formal notice is issued to the registered owner. That owner has 15 days to respond. If they do not, Dubai municipality tows and stores the vehicle. The owner then has 6 months to reclaim it, to settle outstanding debts, clear the paperwork, and physically retrieve their property. If no one comes, the car is permanently seized and eventually auctioned, often at a fraction of its original market value. On paper, this is an orderly process. In practice, it describes a city where the owners of Ferraris have calculated that it is safer to board a flight and never look back than to stay and face what they owe. That calculation is not irrational. It is, in fact, entirely logical given the legal architecture Dubai built for itself. For decades, the emirate operated without meaningful personal bankruptcy protection. If you could not pay your debts, you could be detained. You could have a travel ban placed on your passport, your bank account frozen, a percentage of your salary redirected by court order to your creditors. The system was designed around an assumption that has quietly shaped everything about how Dubai works, that the people who come here will succeed, will spend beyond their means to project that success, and will either pay up or disappear. For a significant number of them, disappearing is exactly what happens. The abandoned supercar is not, at its core, a story about wealth. It is a story about the fragility of the image of wealth and about what happens when a city builds its entire identity on the performance of prosperity, and the performers start to exit the stage. The visual spectacle of a Lamborghini rotting in a desert parking lot is striking precisely because it creates cognitive dissonance. Dubai is the city of the Burj Khalifa. Dubai is the city of the Palm Jumeirah. Dubai is the city that appears in every promotional image to have solved the problem of scarcity itself. And yet here, in this corner that the promotional images never capture, the mathematics of that image are laid bare. Someone bought a car they could not ultimately afford. Someone borrowed against an income that turned out to be temporary. Someone arrived with a dream that the city actively encouraged and then found themselves trapped between the dream and the consequences of pursuing it. What makes this phenomenon significant is not the drama of the individual stories, though those stories are real and they are numerous. What makes it significant is that it has been happening continuously at a scale of thousands of vehicles per year, for long enough that Dubai has developed an entire bureaucratic infrastructure to manage it. The abandoned supercar is not an anomaly. It is a feature of the system. And to understand why that system produces this outcome, reliably, repeatedly, across economic cycles and across different categories of wealth, you have to understand something deeper about how Dubai was constructed and for whom. Dubai did not become what it is by accident. It became what it is by design, a specific, deliberate and extraordinarily ambitious design that began taking shape in the 1980s and accelerated dramatically after the turn of the millennium. The city's leadership understood early that Dubai's oil reserves, unlike those of Abu Dhabi to its west, were limited. The petroleum sector that once accounted for nearly half of the Emirates' economic output now contributes less than 1% of its GDP. That transformation required a replacement engine, and the engine Dubai chose was people, specifically foreign people arriving in continuous waves, bringing capital, skills, spending power, and, crucially, the willingness to perform a particular kind of life. The numbers are staggering in their consistency. Today, approximately 87% of Dubai's population of 3.85 million residents are expatriates. Only 13% are Emirati citizens. This is not a demographic curiosity. It is the load-bearing structure of the entire economy. The hotels, the restaurants, the shopping malls, the real estate developments, the financial services firms, the construction sites, all of it runs on imported labor and imported ambition. The system was engineered to attract people by offering something that almost no other major global city could match: tax-free income, no income tax, no capital gains tax, a salary that, on paper, arrives whole. The promise worked. It worked spectacularly. Professionals from India, Pakistan, the United Kingdom, the Philippines, Lebanon, Egypt, Russia, and dozens of other countries arrived in successive generations, drawn by the arithmetic of accumulation that Dubai made possible. And when they arrived, they found a city that was very good at one particular thing: selling them a version of themselves. The car dealerships, the real estate brokers, the luxury goods boutiques, the weekend brunches, the marina berths, all of it existed within an ecosystem designed to convert income into expenditure and expenditure into identity. This is where the legal architecture becomes critical. For most of Dubai's modern history, personal bankruptcy, in the Western sense of the word, a legal process by which an individual could discharge unmanageable debts, restructure their obligations, and begin again, did not exist in a meaningful or accessible form. What existed instead was a system that could respond to debt default with travel bans, asset freezes, salary garnishments, and in certain cases, criminal prosecution. Bounce checks, for instance, were for decades treated as a criminal offence in the UAE rather than a civil matter. The implications of this were profound and specific. It meant that an expatriate professional who had taken on a car loan, a personal loan, and a mortgage, all offered aggressively by banks that competed fiercely for their business, had essentially no legal exit ramp if their financial situation deteriorated. Job loss, medical emergency, business failure, any of these events could transform a comfortable tax-free salary into an inescapable debt spiral. And unlike a citizen of Germany or Australia or Canada, this person had no family home to return to within the country, no social safety net to catch them, no political constituency that would advocate for their interests. They had one viable option: leave quickly and leave everything behind. The UAE did eventually introduce meaningful legal reforms. A personal insolvency law was enacted, allowing individuals to file for structured debt repayment plans. The new federal bankruptcy law, which came into force on the 1st of May 2024, introduced dedicated bankruptcy courts and expanded definitions of debtor protections, bringing the UAE closer to international standards. Bounce checks were largely decriminalized for simple non-payment cases. These are genuine and significant changes, but they came after decades of a system that had already shaped behavior in ways that do not simply disappear when the law is updated. The culture of debt concealment, of strategic departure, of abandoning physical assets rather than facing legal consequences, that culture was produced by decades of legal architecture that made flight more rational than restructuring. The consequences of this structure are visible not only in the car graveyards, but in the rental market, in the labor statistics, and in the quiet economic anxiety that sits beneath Dubai's polished surface. A survey by Dubai-based recruitment agency Cooper Fitch, covering more than 1,000 organizations, found that average salary increases across the UAE were projected at 0% for 2025, in a city where rents rose by an average of 16% in the 12 months leading up to December 2024. That gap, flat salaries and sharply rising costs, is not an abstract economic indicator. It is a lived experience for the majority of Dubai's residents, who are expatriates on fixed contracts, without citizenship, without long-term tenure security, and without the safety net that might allow them to absorb a financial shock. The expatriate model that built Dubai is also, therefore, the model that produces its most visible symptoms of fragility. The abandoned Lamborghini is not the story of one reckless spender. It is the story of a system that recruited people by promising them a certain kind of life, provided them with easy access to the financial instruments needed to perform that life, and then offered them no graceful exit when the performance became unaffordable. The car stays, the person leaves, and the city absorbs the image until the image becomes impossible to ignore. On the surface, and the surface in Dubai is always immaculate, 2025 looked like the year the city finally validated every ambitious claim it had ever made about itself. The numbers were not merely good, they were historic. Real estate transactions across the emirate reached nearly 917 billion dirhams, roughly $250 billion, the highest total ever recorded in Dubai's history. More than 270,000 individual deals were closed, reflecting a breadth of participation that stretched from ultra-luxury Palm Jumeirah mansions to mid-market apartment blocks in emerging communities. Residential deals alone accounted for around 200,000 transactions worth 538 billion dirhams. The luxury segment was particularly extraordinary. In the first half of 2025, 3,731 transactions were recorded at values of at least 10 million dirhams each, a 63% jump from the same period a year earlier. Among the headline sales, a 60,000 square foot mansion in Emirates Hills that changed hands for 750 million dirhams. Another property in Dubai Hills estate sold for 150 million dirhams. International high net worth buyers, according to a Knight Frank report, allocated $4.4 billion to Dubai's residential market in 2024 alone, a 76% increase from the year before. By any conventional measure, this was a city at the apex of its appeal. Tourism told a similar story. Dubai welcomed 18.72 million international visitors in 2024, up from 17.15 million in 2023, marking a 9.15% year-over-year increase. The city's 832 hotels recorded an average occupancy rate that placed Dubai consistently among the top-performing destinations globally. The Dubai Mall, already the world's most visited retail destination, registered 100 million visits in 2024. In the first half of 2025, a further 9.88 million international visitors had arrived, up 6% on the same period in 2024. Projections from the World Travel and Tourism Council suggested that the UAE as a whole was on track to welcome 27.6 million international visitors across 2025. But inside these record numbers, three structural pressures were building simultaneously, and none of them was prominently featured in the promotional releases. The first was supply. Dubai launched a record number of new real estate projects in 2024, producing an estimated pipeline of 150,000 units. Deliveries were projected to spike in 2026, with approximately 120,000 units planned for handover in that year alone, compared to 30,000 in 2024 and 90,000 in 2025. The total pipeline for the 2025 to 2027 period was cited by multiple analysts at over 200,000 residential units, double the construction rate of the preceding three-year average. Ratings agency Fitch was among the first to draw the conclusion plainly. A double-digit decline in property prices was likely to begin in the second half of 2025 and extend through 2026 as supply overwhelmed absorption capacity. The UBS Global Real Estate Bubble Index for 2025 placed Dubai in the high-risk category, noting that prices had surged more than 50% over the preceding 5 years, the highest rate of increase among all 25 cities analysed in the study. Vacancy rates, according to data from property consultancy Azteco, were sitting at 8.4% for apartments and 5.2% for villas as of the fourth quarter of 2024. Healthy markets typically run between 5 and 8% vacancy. Dubai's apartment vacancy was already at the upper edge of that range, and the units had not yet started arriving in volume. The second pressure was the wage-to-rent divergence already described, stagnant salaries against rapidly rising living costs. This was quietly reshaping who could actually sustain life in Dubai at the consumption level the city's economy required. The population was growing, which sustained demand for housing, but the character of that demand was shifting. Middle-income expatriates, the backbone of the professional service economy, were finding Dubai increasingly unaffordable as a long-term destination. The city was becoming simultaneously more expensive and less rewarding for the professional class that had historically powered it. The third pressure was geopolitical image. Dubai had spent decades carefully cultivating a reputation as a neutral, stable and cosmopolitan hub, a city where the conflicts of the surrounding region did not arrive. That reputation was an economic asset as real as any skyscraper because it was the reason global capital felt comfortable flowing in, the reason wealthy individuals from politically unstable countries parked their money there, and the reason tourists from Europe and Asia chose Dubai over its regional competitors. That reputation, it would turn out, was more fragile than the property valuations it underpinned. There is a date that now divides Dubai's recent economic history into a before and an after. On February 28, 2026, the Dubai Financial Market Real Estate Index reached a peak of 16,910 points. It had gained 63% across 2024 and 38% across 2023. It represented the culmination of a 5-year run that had produced cumulative residential price growth of between 60 and 75% across the market. On that date, Dubai's property sector looked not merely healthy, but structurally dominant. Within 2 weeks, the index had dropped 30%. The trigger was a geopolitical event of a kind Dubai had long assumed would remain at a comfortable remove from its borders. The United States and Israel launched military strikes against Iran. Iran's supreme leader was killed. Tehran's retaliation was swift and broad, targeting Israel, American military installations, and Gulf states including the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain. For a city that had built its economic identity on the premise of neutrality and safety, on the specific promise that it existed outside the region's conflicts, the psychological impact was immediate and severe. The financial markets responded within days. The Dubai Financial Market Real Estate Index erased every gain made in 2025 within a fortnight, a speed of decline that, as analysts noted, surpassed even the 2028 financial crisis in terms of velocity. During the 2008 crash, it had taken months for Dubai's property values to fall 30%. This time, it happened in 2 weeks. The difference in speed is itself significant. In 2028, the collapse was driven by a global credit freeze that unwound gradually. In 2026, it was driven by sentiment, by the sudden evaporation of the perception of safety that had been Dubai's most valuable and least quantifiable economic asset. The tourism sector absorbed the impact almost simultaneously. Dubai airports reported that first-quarter passenger traffic was down by at least 2.5 million compared to the same period in 2025. March 2026 saw a 66% drop in passenger numbers as travelers rerouted away from the Gulf entirely. Luxury hotel occupancy on Palm Jumeirah, the artificial island that had come to symbolize Dubai's mastery of aspiration, made physical, fell below 20%. 80,000 short-term rental bookings were cancelled in a single week. The tourism sector, which directly accounts for approximately 13% of Dubai's GDP and sustains close to 925,000 jobs, the overwhelming majority of them held by non-citizen workers, began hemorrhaging revenue at an estimated $600 million per day in losses. The UAE government responded. Air travel restrictions imposed following the Iranian strikes were lifted relatively quickly. Diplomatic communications were activated. The message the authorities sought to project was one of resilience and continuity. Dubai had navigated shocks before. It had absorbed the 2028 global financial crisis, the 2020 pandemic, and various regional tensions without structural collapse. The official posture was that this was another temporary disruption to a fundamentally sound model. But temporary disruptions have a way of exposing the pre-existing vulnerabilities in the systems they strike, and the geopolitical shock of early 2026 did not create Dubai's structural pressures. It merely made them visible in a compressed timeframe. The oversupply pipeline did not appear because of the Iran conflict. The wage-to-rent divergence did not emerge because of the Iran conflict. The debt flight culture that produces 3,000 abandoned cars per year did not originate with the Iran conflict. What the conflict did was collapse the timeline in which these converging pressures would have otherwise played out slowly and present the result all at once, as a dramatic, measurable, globally visible reversal of a city that had come to represent something very specific: the idea that a place could be engineered entirely for success. What disappeared in those 2 weeks was not primarily financial value. Financial value in liquid markets oscillates, and serious analysts noted that the physical property transaction market had not collapsed in the way the index suggested. 87% of Dubai property purchases in 2025 had been cash transactions, meaning there was no mortgage leverage crisis of the kind that caused systemic bank failures in 2028. What disappeared was the narrative, and in a city where narrative is infrastructure, where the story of Dubai is as economically important as its ports or its airport, the loss of narrative coherence has consequences that no index fully captures. The comparison to 2008 arrives quickly whenever Dubai faces a moment of economic stress, and it arrived quickly again in the weeks following the February 2026 shock. Social media accounts, financial commentary platforms, and clickable headlines reached for the parallel with obvious enthusiasm. The framing was predictable. Dubai had crashed before, Dubai was crashing again, and this time would be worse. The comparison deserves serious examination because it contains both a legitimate warning and a significant analytical error, and understanding which is which matters enormously for understanding what Dubai's situation actually is. In 2028, Dubai's crisis was a product of leverage. The real estate market of the mid-2000s had been built on speculative capital, short-term flipping, and off-plan purchases by investors who had no intention of occupying or renting the properties they bought. They needed only the price to keep rising. When the global financial crisis froze credit markets worldwide, that model collapsed overnight. Property prices fell 40.2% in the first quarter of 2029 alone. Peak to trough, the decline reached between 50 and 60%. Major government-linked developers defaulted on their obligations. Dubai World, the state conglomerate, requested a debt standstill on approximately $26 billion in November 2029. Abu Dhabi intervened with financial support, including direct bond purchases, to prevent a systemic collapse. The recovery took years. It was not until the mid-2010s that many areas approached their pre-crash price levels. 2026 is structurally different in ways that matter. According to data cited by multiple independent property analysts, 87% of Dubai real estate transactions in 2025 were conducted in cash, not through mortgage financing. End-user demand accounted for over 70% of transactions, meaning buyers were purchasing homes to live in or rent out, not primarily to flip. The city's population had grown from approximately 3 million in 2028 to over 4.2 million in 2026, generating real underlying demand for housing. The UAE's mortgage debt as a proportion of GDP remained under 18%, far below the 60% levels associated with bubble markets in other global cities. None of this means that a price correction is not coming or is not already underway. The oversupply picture is real. Fitch Ratings had projected a double-digit decline in property prices before the geopolitical shock even arrived. The pipeline of 200,000-plus residential units, scheduled for delivery between 2025 and 2027, will not disappear because of a war. When that supply hits a market that is simultaneously experiencing reduced tourism, declining foreign investor confidence, and population uncertainty, the result will be downward pressure on prices that no amount of official communication can prevent. But analysts at Knight Frank, Standard & Poor's, JLL, Savills and Colliers, the institutions that actually model these outcomes rather than merely headline them, were not projecting anything approaching the 50 to 60% crash scenarios circulating on social platforms. Knight Frank's base case, assuming the geopolitical conflict shortens significantly, projected 3.2% prime residential growth for 2026. The more pessimistic scenario, an extended regional conflict lasting through 2026, projected physical property price corrections of between 15 and 25%. Significant, certainly. Painful for many investors, but not the structural collapse that the 2028 comparison implies. The more instructive lesson from 2028 is not the depth of the fall. It is what the fall revealed, that Dubai's growth model had, at that point, become detached from economic fundamentals and was running entirely on the expectation of continued price appreciation. When that expectation evaporated, there was nothing underneath to catch the market. The question that 2026 poses for Dubai is a subtler version of the same question. Not whether Dubai will crash in the way it crashed in 2028, the structural differences make that exact scenario unlikely, but whether the model of growth on which the city depends is as robust as the record numbers suggested, or whether those records were, in part, the product of conditions that cannot be sustained indefinitely. That is a harder question to answer, and it requires looking not at what happened over 2 dramatic weeks in early 2026, but at the slower, quieter pressures that had been building for years underneath the record transactions and the tourist arrival figures. There is a particular kind of economic system that works brilliantly under conditions of continuous expansion and becomes fragile the moment growth slows. Dubai is, in its deepest structural sense, an example of that system. Not because its leaders designed it carelessly, but because the logic of the city's founding premise requires growth as a permanent condition rather than a periodic one. Consider what it takes for Dubai to remain Dubai in the sense that matters economically. It requires a constant inflow of high-income expatriates willing to pay rising rents. It requires a continuous stream of international investors purchasing real estate, not just to live in, but as a store of value in a city they trust. It requires tourists arriving in sufficient volume to fill the 832 hotels, the thousands of restaurants, the retail developments, the experience attractions, and the Airbnb inventory that now constitutes a significant and growing portion of the short-term accommodation market. It requires all 3 of these flows, residents, investors, visitors, to remain simultaneously active because each one supports the others. Investor confidence drives property values. Rising property values attract wealthy residents who spend in the economy. Resident spending sustains the service economy that makes the city livable for tourists. Tourists validate the city's global reputation, which in turn attracts more investors. This is not a cycle, it is a spiral, and spirals, by definition, must keep moving in one direction or they reverse. The pipeline of residential supplies scheduled for delivery between 2025 and 2027, more than 200,000 units by widely cited estimates, represents the most concrete structural challenge Dubai faces independent of geopolitics. The history of supply shocks in Dubai's property market is well documented. In 2028, the supply shock coincided with a demand shock and produced a 50% collapse. In the more recent cycle, disciplined supply management between 2015 and 2020 helped the market recover its footing before the post-pandemic boom. What is different now is scale. The number of units scheduled for delivery in 2026 alone, approximately 120,000, is 4 times the volume delivered in 2024. Even with strong underlying population growth, which is real and well documented, the absorption of that supply over a compressed timeline will test the market's structural depth in ways it has not been tested before. Absorption depends on who is arriving, and the profile of who is arriving in Dubai is quietly shifting in ways that the aggregate population growth statistics do not fully capture. The inflow of ultra-high net worth individuals, accelerated by the post-pandemic capital flight from Russia, the European tax environment, and political instability in various source markets, brought a specific kind of buyer to Dubai: cash-rich, globally mobile, and purchasing as much for asset protection as for lifestyle. That buyer has been essential to sustaining the luxury segment's record-breaking performance. But that buyer is also the most sensitive to geopolitical perception. They are not moving to Dubai because they have no other options. They are moving to Dubai because it is, in their assessment, the best available option at a given moment. When the assessment changes, when the Palm Jumeirah hotel occupancy rate falls below 20% and the financial index drops 30% in 2 weeks, the globally mobile capital that arrived most recently is also the capital most capable of departing. Below the ultra-luxury tier, the picture is defined by the wage-to-rent compression that has been building steadily. Rents rose by an average of 16% in the 12 months through December 2024. Salaries, according to Cooper Fitch's survey of more than 1,000 organizations, were projected to grow by 0% across the UAE in 2025. The practical consequence of that divergence, sustained over multiple years, is a gradual erosion of the middle-income expatriate base. The engineers, the teachers, The accountants, the healthcare workers, the marketing professionals, whose aggregate spending constitutes the foundation of the city's everyday economy. They do not make headlines when they leave. They do not abandon Lamborghinis in airport parking lots. They simply do not renew their contracts, or they accept postings elsewhere, or they quietly conclude that the arithmetic of Dubai no longer works in their favor. Their departure is invisible until it accumulates into a vacancy rate that starts to exceed what the delivery pipeline can justify. The D33 Agenda, Dubai's ambitious 10-year economic strategy announced in 2022, targets a doubling of the Emirates' GDP by 2033 and aims to position Dubai among the top 3 global cities for business and quality of life. It calls for infrastructure investment, expanded trade connectivity, tourism target of 40 million visitors per year, and population growth to accommodate an economy of that scale. These are real commitments, backed by real capital deployment. Airport expansion at Dubai World Central, new metro lines, technology district development, regulatory reform designed to attract global talent. The ambition is not performative. Dubai has a credible record of executing infrastructure at speed. But the D33 agenda, like every major Dubai strategic vision before it, is built on a growth assumption. It works if the spiral keeps moving. And the events of early 2026, the geopolitical shock, the property index drop, the collapsed tourism quarter, the cancelled bookings, the stalled investor confidence, collectively describe a moment when the spiral paused, not reversed as the 2028 crisis had reversed it. Paused. And in a system designed for continuous motion, even a pause has consequences that compound quickly, because each pillar of the model supports the others. When tourism drops, the short-term rental market contracts, reducing returns for property investors. When investor returns compress, new capital inflows slow, softening property prices. When property prices soften, the wealth effect that drives high-end consumer spending diminishes. When consumer spending declines, the service economy that employs 925,000 workers comes under pressure, and those workers who are overwhelmingly non-citizen expatriates with no permanent claim on the city begin to recalculate their own arithmetic. The abandoned Lamborghini in the airport parking lot is, in the end, a small and very personal version of a much larger question that Dubai has not yet fully answered. What happens to a city built entirely on the expectation of arrival when people start to consider leaving? Not collapsing, not failing in any dramatic or final sense, simply pausing, reconsidering, choosing for now somewhere else. Because the city's entire architecture, its economics, its legal structure, its social contract, its physical expansion was engineered for one condition and one condition only, that the next person is always on their way. The numbers as of the middle of 2026 suggest that for the first time in a generation, Dubai's leadership cannot be entirely certain that they are.